Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. And let's start. So I'll be speaking about CSS-in-JS in the React ecosystem, and specifically focusing on style components and emotion. So a little bit about myself. This is my family. I'm a family man. I work less than most people. I'm a digital nomad. I am also a very opinionated guy. I like to argue. I specialize in front-end web. I teach people, developers, about the stuff that I know about. And I usually work through a company called Code Value. And let's start. So, topics to cover: where and why CSS fails in the age of components and apps, how CSS-in-JS can help us, an overview of style and emotion, best practices, I hope we'll have time for that, and demo, I hope we'll have time for that. So, CSS is amazing. I love CSS. I really do. It is powerful, and it is ever improving, and it is now better than ever before, and it is great. It is flexible and expresses the entire richness of the web. Every website you see is styled using CSS. It is easy to start with, which is a very good thing. It is hard to master, which is why a lot of people don't get it right. They just don't bother. I don't know why. And as a testament to that, I know only a couple of people in person who know CSS better than me. I say that with great sorrow because I wish people knew more CSS. CSS-in-JS is not a replacement for CSS, and it's just another way of authoring CSS. It's another way of styling and using CSS. So, CSS is my bread and butter. Why do I allow myself to talk to you guys about CSS here and its troubles and stuff like that? Because I've written a whole bunch of CSS. So I've been working on the web and styling things for over a decade, managing teams, consulting. I've been working on content sites with server-side rendering. I've been working on third-party widgets, think stuff like Taboola widgets, or things like what this company does, although it's invisible, but still it's the same idea. I've been working on single-page applications, client-only and isomorphic with server-side rendering. And I've been juggling all the above in various ways. So, technologies. On the web, I've used inline styles, CSS, less Sass, CSS modules, styled components, and emotion. I've been policing BEM, which is block element modifier, thank you, for a while until I gave it up. I'll touch on that a little bit. And as of recently, I've been working a little bit with React Native, with Bear styling, the style sheet API, and also using emotion. Emotion, the library. There's no real emotion in React Native. So this looks like a promising start. The trouble with CSS, I'll let you read. So, yeah, that's not the trouble with CSS. The real trouble with CSS is that it is not reusable, is that it is a language which is append only. You know how you open a style sheet and then you scroll and you scroll and you scroll and you scroll, and past 1,000 lines you just close it and you go home? So modern CSS frameworks aren't interoperable. Each is like a country with its own language, concepts, conventions, which are expressed using CSS classes, selectors, and specificity. The result is incompatible monoliths, which do not allow for easy code sharing, modularity, and reuse. So, yeah, elections. Let's make a poll. So who here knows what specificity is? All right. Nobody knows really what specificity is. Okay, I mean, I interview people and nobody knows it by term. Most people know it by hunch, sort of like what it's supposed to do, but nobody knows how it actually works. And neither do I know it, by heart, like to calculate actual specificity. I do know the mechanism and how it works. Specificity is the way the browser decides how to style a given element when it has conflicting styling. So let's say you have an anchor, a link, and you have one selector and rule which says color red and another one which says color green. How does the browser determine in which color to color the anchor? That's what specificity is for. Now, how do you fix specificity conflicts? Anyone? Yeah, important. You dropped the bomb. So you can do a variety of things. You can use a tag name to increase the specificity of the selector. You can use this fancy method, which is non-specific way of increasing specificity. You can use this thing of chaining class names, which some would call a hack, others would call not, but it's not really clear. And some people resort to this, which I hope nobody ever does, but we've all been there. So, and now, how reliable is that fix? In how many hours or days are you going to have to get back to that same place in the code and troubleshoot why the fucking thing is red and not green when it should be? So, why is CSS broken? Move the mouse. Yeah, this is something fancy which I didn't write. It's the evolution of technologies on the web. And the times are changing. So let's do another poll. Who here has recently worked on a content site? A site which the visitors come to mostly consume content, to read. Very few people. Even less than those who know what specificity is. Now, I mean really a real content site with server-side rendering, SEO, and thousands of URLs. Okay, that's not a lot. I rest my case. Did you need to style things dynamically? That's a question for everyone. In your web apps, which are not websites. I did need to style things dynamically practically every day. Now show me the doll on the doll where the cascade touched you. We can't get rid of the cascade, unfortunately, at least until we have how's it called, the scope styles and shadow DOM. We're not really there yet. Anyway, we're mostly writing apps, not pages nowadays, not websites. We're just using web technology to write apps. Now, CSS fails us in a component and app world. Our tooling must evolve. So this is the World Wide Web of the 1990s. It was a beautiful time. Separation of concerns, old school. Remember web pages? Information superhighway. Content consumption was the main activity. And then we had the three layers, right? You had the structural HTML. You had the presentational CSS on top of it. And then you had JavaScript sprinkles here and there to modify something, to make something move. So this is a component library. And this is more like today's web apps. So a modern separation of concerns is by components. So you have a button and a date picker and a modal and a list and media and whatever. And each is a feature, which includes the HTML, the JavaScript, and the styling to make that feature interactive and not static. Components rule the world. Who here has read The Great Divide, which is a post by Chris Coyer, I think, the guy from CSS Tricks? Yeah, so it's a good post. You should read it. It talks about how there are two different types of front-end developers, those who do apps and those who do sites. And they have usually different concerns, and they use different technologies. So CSS-in-JS mostly belongs in the apps world. Okay, it's not limited to it, but it definitely does belong to that. You can also use it for sites. You can also not, but in the apps, it has an advantage. In sites, less so. So CSS in the component, app, and age. We have no scope or isolation. We write components, not sites nowadays. That's the problem. We have specificity wars, which is increasing specificity to overwrite things, and then it overwrites something else, and then you have to deal with that. It's like Z-index wars. Do you know that? That's fun. Juggling selectors to match markup is also not fun. So when you need to move something from green to red, you add a class, or you remove a class, or you toggle a class, or you switch classes. Not fun. Cascade instead of isolation is what we have. And so for scoping, selectors fail us. For specificity wars, selectors fail us. And juggling selectors is not fun. We can fix selectors. We can't fix the cascade nowadays. Now this is really old news. So the climate really is getting warmer. This is from 1958, okay? So this is old news. I'll just read this. In November 2014, which is like prehistorical times in terms of front end, Christopher Shadow, who is working on React and React Native at Facebook, gave a thought-provoking talk titled CSS-in-JS. He outlined the problems of CSS at scale and later showed how they solved these at Facebook. They were able to solve most, but in return had to add a lot of additional tooling. Then he introduced a complete new approach to handle those issues without any actual extra work, using inline styles. It seemed crazy, but it just worked magically. And this is the very famous slide from that talk, which outlines the problems of CSS at scale. We're not going to go over it. We're going to continue. So the talk created shockwaves and turmoil in the front-end community. Is this a joke? I threw up in my throat. Never do this. Don't repeat mistakes of the past. Worst web dev idea of all time, or just a really bad one? So many things to avoid writing CSS. So yeah. Now, aren't we reinventing the wheel with CSS and JS? Don't CSS modules, Sass, and post-CSS and the whole post-CSS plugins ecosystem do the same? Can't block element modifier and competing conventions help us? So, yeah, I'm talking from experience. Okay, I tried it. No, it's not good enough. I'm sorry. So conventions need policing, which always fails at scale. You can police one person, two people, three people, but then, you just end up chasing people and telling them, don't do this, don't do that, do that, and they just hate you, and it sucks. Don't go there. Preprocessors don't come anywhere near what's possible with CSS and JS. CSS-in-JS lets us reimagine what's possible compared to plain old CSS. So you get stuff like dead code elimination, code coverage and testing of CSS and of styling. You get critical CSS inlining above the fold, which is actually not that relevant for apps, but you can have that on content sites. You get smarter optimizations. So HTML and CSS, which is basically a fancy name for all of the modern frameworks, React, Vue, and Angular, you can call them HTML and JS. And CSS and JS combined give you super minification with name mangling like we've had in JavaScript only land for forever. Stuff like Common Chunks plugin, which means that if I bring a component, I bring its styling. So if I render something conditionally, I don't need to bring its style sheet. And you get standard libraries instead of the current CSS silos. Think stuff like Lodash in JavaScript, only for styling. And you can get CSS component packages. So standardization, modularity, and code reuse, which are all good things. Yeah, there's more. So there's this. And CSS-in-JS gives us that. Non-browser styling. So we have React Native Style Sheet API. You can have cross-platform styling. Did you know that when you, I think it's mobile.twitter.com, is written in React Native for web? It is an app which is written in React Native, but is rendered to the web. It's a good question. I bet the guy who's behind it, I don't know his name, I bet he has answered it. And you get a whole bunch of different libraries which give you cross-platform styling. You have Yoga, which is the layout engine which implements Flexbox, which is our next lecture today, in a variety of different programming languages, and React Native uses that. And you can have custom renderers like React SketchUp. And this slide is actually from over a year and a half ago when I gave the same lecture. And since then, there's been a whole bunch of new developments in this arena. So it's amazing. But let's focus on the style ecosystem and React. So there's a bunch of stuff. There's emotion and style components, and there's rebase and polished and style system. And we love React because its component model and API make a very good DOM abstraction. Well, guess what? The same applies to styling. And these are our weapons of choice: style components and emotion. They are the two most popular ones. There's a couple of new contenders which have their own advantages. But these are the standard nowadays. So if you want to get started, look at them, into them first, and only then evaluate alternatives. Competition is good. Both are always improving and are practically identical in React. The only two differences that there are today between the two are that emotion has real source maps. Who here knows what source maps are? Okay, I won't elaborate. And emotion is not limited only to React. You can use it on any web page, and also in React Native. So, ancient history. How did React transform HTML and JavaScript, and how we reason about it and how we work with it? So it was the very first library which made HTML in JS not suck. How did it do that? Using components, which is a good abstraction model, which is easy to reason about, and it composes well. And JS6, which is syntactic sugar to compose components. So JS6 has taught us how separation of concerns is not separation of technologies. Remember stuff like Backbone and I don't know, Knockout and jQuery, where you had HTML separately and JavaScript separately, and then you had to glue the two together. And we all used to say, hey, these are two different technologies. This is JavaScript and this is HTML, and they shouldn't be tied. So JS6 has taught us that juggling HTML and JavaScript is not fun. They belong together. So styled and emotion are the same, only for styling. They do the same thing. So what if I told you there's no class names? We're in the matrix now. Without class names, selectors, and specificity, you get to focus on what CSS is really for, which is styling. That's what you came for. You don't want to write selectors. You don't want to write class names, right? You just want to make things look pretty. So that's what it enables us. These are class names. So, do I hate class names? No, but I would rather not deal with them given the choice. And we do have the choice. So class names have no semantic meaning. They don't play anything in SEO. They have no value. Okay, they are a means to an end. They are the vessel, not the message. You don't style using class names. You style using their contents, right? The rule. They are painful to maintain and juggle when changing styling, right? The whole, let's turn this green thing into red and vice versa. And how do you do that? Using string manipulation, which is a whole lot of fun, right? And you have a bunch of libraries which help you juggle those class names, right? Use in React specifically, using Boolean flags and whatnot. Fuck that. They are global, which CSS modules actually work around, but if you work just with CSS, it's not fun. So this is blue, and this is CSS, and I have something that's called primary, and I want to show it in red color. Simple, right? And now I have a markup. I have a button with class primary and some text, and I want to make it red. So how do I do that? I tie the two together. And this is glue. So we want to get rid of the glue if we can, and we can. So what if I told you there's no class names? All I want is a goddamn red button. So this is how you do it. You import styled, and you say red button, color red. Okay, it's a button with color red. Okay, I don't know how you can write this any shorter. And then you render it. And it actually says red button. That's amazing. I don't care about class names. I don't see them here. Yeah, these examples are straight from the docs. So isn't that just inline styles, which we all hate, rightfully so, because they are problematic, because they are a subset of CSS. You don't have media queries and pseudo elements and pseudo classes, and it's shit. So no, these are not inline styles. This is how that red button renders. So it does add a class. I just don't see it. I don't care about it. And it does render, it does create a style sheet with the color red. I just don't manage it. And so the point is, you get all of CSS. You get pseudo classes and pseudo elements and media queries and feature queries and animations, and the present and future CSS will just work. You do not have to compromise. Now, older CSS-in-JS libraries, a few years ago, the first and second generations, they used inline styles, and they sucked, and they did not hold water. They're dead now. They were a stepping stone to where we are today. and where we are today is a much better place. So styling any component. Let's say you have something which is not styled, not an instance of styled component or emotion. Okay, it's just plain React. So think of, I don't know, React Select or whatever, something, an npm package which you installed, and now you want to style it using emotion or styled components. So you wrap it in styled, and then you add styling, and guess what? It just works. Now it works as long as the component accepts a class name prop, which every single React component does. So any component, really. Let's say you want to style two things identically when they are not identical. So here we have a section which is styled, right? And I want to clone that, I want to reuse that styling for a different element. So what I use is I do aside section with component aside. So this is the new tag name, and then I just use it, and I get an aside element, an aside tag name, which is styled like a section. Now, when you do need selectors, you still have them. Okay, you can use this funky, but I would argue familiar syntax to override styling of a child node. But actually, I use this very rarely. I'd rather not, because this here ties us to a relationship of child-parent, which you would rather avoid. I wouldn't do it like this, but if you have to, you can do it. In addition to that, you can just add a selector here. You can just add a class name here if you are working with something which relies on class names. So you can still use all of CSS, including selectors. You're not giving up on anything. And it is a superset of CSS. So emotion and styled give us auto prefixing built in. No need to configure it. You get server-side rendering, style extraction, inlining, and client hydration in the React ecosystem for free. You get source maps only in emotion. I forgot to mention it here. You get theming out of the box for both of them. So if your app needs themes, think stuff like Slack or Gmail, you already have a way to do that. You don't have to invent that wheel. And you can use the very same API with global styles using the same component API. If you have dynamic styling, no problem. So we have a button which can be either primary or not. And we have a container which can be which can accept an optional prop of a column, in which case it changes the flex direction. And just use it like this. So this guy here in the container gives us this value, right? And this guy here gives us the color hot pink and not the default. Simple, right? You know how to do this if you're working with React. Only here you're styling instead of thinking of, this is my CSS, this is my markup, and now I need to somehow connect the two using class names. Dynamic style composition. So let's say you have more than trivial things. Okay, you have complex, reusable dynamic styles which you want to compose together. You can do that. You use a helper, which is called CSS, because it's CSS, the important part of it of styling, and not the selector part. and you can just say, I want to accept a prop of color. And usually here, you would also add a fallback, like, or red or whatever, unless you're using TypeScript, in which case you're good to go. And now you can compose. This is nice. You can't do that really in the same way with selectors. I mean, you can, but you get into specificity issues. So we also have mature tooling. Snapshot testing in Jest, who here uses Jest for testing. You can actually test styling and not guess whether the latest change broke something. You get TypeScript love if you're into that, which you should, but never mind that. You get linting. You get linting inside of the dynamic parts of the of styling. So you have a function which accepts a prop. You can lint it, and you can also use style lint to enforce best practices in styling. You get editor and IDE extensions, which give you code completion and nice things like that. The style ecosystem. So you have polished, which is like Lodash only for styling. Think things from the Sass ecosystem, functions like lighten, opacify, and transform one form of color notation to another, like RGB to hex, RGBA to something. You give it a color and you want it to do some transformation, and it just does that. Or extracting the units from CSS, doing math with units, you can do that. Rebas, which is styling as React props. It's a very certain way which kind of does. It's a very certain way of styling which kind of does aim to replace CSS. I personally don't like it as much, but there's a lot of people who do. You get reusable components, a whole lot of them. So styled has been out there for a while, and there's a bunch of code which you can reuse. There's entire component libraries which are written for either styled or emotion, and the most recent ones in the past year or so at least are agnostic. They don't care whether you use emotion or styled. It's a peer dependency, and you install that and it just works. Yeah, icons, grid systems, whatever. It's like a whole thing. Styled best practices and demo. So this is an important part. So I don't have many best practices. I've been working with this stuff for over 1.5 years now. And I don't have many best practices, in my opinion, best practices in regards to styled. This is one of them, and this is a strong one. And that's co-location. I'll show you. So this is the code base. And let's say this. So an example. So this is a React component. Select detected customer text. If you don't like TypeScript, then ignore this. The point is that I want to make is that, first of all, so this is CSS, as you can see. We have also some dynamic props. So this is styled. And the actual point is that I want to talk in components which include the styling as part of them. A lot of people who start with styled or emotion, they do what they have been taught for the last 20 years, which is, okay, I do my styling here, I put it in a different file, and I do my components there, and then I import the style from the styles file, and then I apply it to the component. Why would you do that? The point is to have them co-located and together. They express the same thing. They belong together. And so don't do that, because you're missing the point of style components, or a lot of its point. And this is how it looks like. I don't know, let's show something. Here I have a title button, which is a button, which is another component, and it's just here. I want to tie the two together, okay? So this is number one. Number two is don't abuse dynamic styling. So what you can do is you can just pass a color prop, and then you're not really writing CSS, right? You are using the runtime part of styled to modify the style sheet in place during rendering. And you should do that if you have to, but you shouldn't do that when you can avoid it. So for example, if you have this kind of ternary expression, okay, styled will create two class names. One with background color tomato, the other with background color medium green, medium sea green. It will not create a dynamic style sheet. It will toggle two different class names for you as a result of the prop that you pass. Okay. As opposed to that, if you pass in, like I had somewhere here, a color, for example, I don't know, I had it in one of the examples. I don't know, if you just pass a color prop, which you can, then it will just generate the style sheet on the fly, which obviously costs performance, and you shouldn't do that unless you have to, unless you really need to. So don't abuse the dynamic styling. And this is opinionated. Don't style using props, which is the opposite of what Ribal does, which is a library where the whole point is styling using props. Now I'll demonstrate. I have it open here somewhere. Okay, this is Ribal, and I'll enlarge like you do in the movies. And see this? So I think it's not readable. Okay, what the hell is P, MX, MY? I don't know. This is probably background. I mean, it's an educated guess. I'm not into that. Now, I think if your entire code base is written like this, you get used to that quickly, and you can be effective and productive, and it's fine. It's not my style, but it's a valid option. And this entire thing is written using it. So you can do stuff like flex. So let's say you don't know how Flexbox works. Just use this API. So there's no such thing as a free lunch. And there's trade-offs. So debugging and developer experience is not as good as it is in JavaScript. But guess what? It's still better than any CSS preprocessor or Sass. The concept is still considered controversial by many, and people get really emotional and defensive over it. Like, you know, you can get shot. Client-side CSS-in-JS runtime, because it has a runtime part to it, obviously comes with an overhead. Okay, it's JavaScript which has to run and modify the DOM, and it has to be delivered. Now, it means higher download and bootstrapping time. It's not a lot, and hopefully and probably it is mitigated by the fact that if you have a content site, you can server-side render it and inline your styles into the head element, so that you get the whole thing styled, and you don't need to wait for JavaScript to download, parse, execute, change the DOM. And your CSS is no longer append only, so your 1,000-line CSS file is reduced to just a few lines, which you actually use. Subsequent processing is also well, yeah, I mentioned it. Anyway, there are trade-offs. Okay, it's not for free, but usually it's a worthy trade-off. So yeah, I like this quote a lot. If anyone has any questions, if we have any more time, I'm not sure. I guess we have time. Yeah.
איך משתמשים בזה? כאילו, איך זה מתמודד עם רספונסיביות, מדיה קווירים וכל זה?
Media queries. I'll show you. So I wish I remembered where the media query was. I don't have many. Hold on. App. So, oh, there we go. Just like that. You just use CSS. More questions? Yeah.
You said something about not using props. How would you handle grids and visuals without a prop like structure?
Okay, so the question is about layout. Yeah. I would argue that if your app has predictable layout, which most apps do, then you just use whatever you use in CSS. If your app is really dynamic, I don't know, think like an operating system where you move windows wherever you want, or maybe changing masonry layout or some crazy stuff like that, then yeah, that's what you need to do. But you don't have to. Yeah. The question is whether in React Native I would start with the Style Sheet API or use Emotion or Styled. I would use Emotion or Styled. I see no reason to deal with the verbosity of the Style Sheet API. It's just low level and it doesn't give you anything more. It gives you the same in a worse API, in my opinion. The question is about third-party CSS frameworks like Bootstrap or Material or Foundation, stuff like that. Yeah, you can just use it as usual. I mean, their API is class names. Add the class name. You're done. The only small caveat that you have to take into consideration is you don't just add the class name. If you want to also style the same element, the same component, you need to accept a class name prop from outside. And then you use both, and then you can style it using Emotion.
So,
yeah. You can use prop types. It's just React components. You can use prop types. No problem. You can use JavaScript and you can use prop types, and it also plays nice with TypeScript. So, yeah.
So if you're building a design system where you have like 5 different buttons or something, you would design specifically each button, or would you have one button component that receives a bunch of props, and like where would you do all the different if statements inside the style component, or in the React component, which then renders 5 different style components?
Good question. It's up to you, up to how you want to.
Like because you meant before you said like to put less dynamic stuff in the style components and more. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you have.
It's a good question. And there's no good answer. I mean, ask the same question about anything which is not styling. How would you do that? You can export 5 different components without a prop. You can export one component which accepts a prop which toggles one of the 5 options. It's up to you. I don't know, however you want, however you see fit. All right. Do I have anything else? No? Thank you.